Ethical relativism, also called moral relativism, is the philosophical view that morality is relative. That is, that the correctness of moral judgments and beliefs are relative to individuals or groups. This view hinges on the observation that there are differences in moral views across time, place, context, and circumstances among individuals and groups. But before we proceed, it would be helpful to clarify its forms and distinguish it from other related theories. First, moral relativism means two different things for philosophy and anthropology. In anthropology, moral relativism is understood in the descriptive sense. Anthropologists report and describe what has been observed in the development of societies and cultures and offer theories as to how things are or how things seem. Cultural relativism, for instance, claims that there are different cultures, each with their own modes of thought and sets of practices. This lends support to descriptive moral relativism, which then claims that moral beliefs and standards are relative. This appears to be a well-supported claim, looking at the scientific and empirical evidence that does prove that there are differences in what cultures consider to be good, right, and moral. For instance, some cultures and nations are more accepting of homosexuality. Some allow same-sex marriages, while others find it deplorable. All over the world, you will find meat-eating communities, but also vegan and vegetarian communities. Abortion appears to be morally permissible in some countries, recognizing it as part of women's reproductive rights, while some consider it a morally reprehensible procedure. You will also recognize the wide array of faith-based moralities, each with their own set of standards. But in the midst of all these differences, anthropology is not concerned with defining the fundamental concepts used in ethics in their relationships. It is also not concerned with evaluating the correctness of these views, nor determining which of these beliefs and practices are more reasonable. It is philosophy, specifically ethics, which evaluates the more metaethical and normative aspects of moral relativism. So, while anthropology describes how things are, philosophy considers what moral concepts are and how things ought to be. This brings us to two distinct but related philosophical positions in moral relativism: metaethical moral relativism and normative moral relativism. Metaethical moral relativism is a philosophical position that claims that the fundamental ethical concepts such as good and bad, right and wrong, and moral and immoral cannot be universally defined, because what they mean and which beliefs and practices fall under these categories will always be relative to the individuals and groups that use them. Disputes on ethical evaluations are essentially unresolvable for metaethical moral relativists, because they claim that moral values and principles are fundamentally different from facts of the universe. So, unlike scientific and mathematical propositions, moral values cannot be subject to objective truth evaluations. This is the view opposite to moral objectivism or moral universalism, which is the belief that there are objective moral standards that apply to all people universally. While culture, race, age, sex, or religion may become sources of disagreements, actions can still be good, right, and moral in a meaningful sense. In other words, this position posits that there are objective standards for moral evaluation that go beyond personal taste and culture, and that moral evaluations can be rationally argued and defended. The metaethical claim of moral relativism is posited in the normative aspect of moral relativism. This normative aspect gives it a prescriptive sense by deriving from it a moral ought. Because moral standards and principles will always be relative, normative moral relativism seems to imply that individuals and groups ought to tolerate all moral disagreements. This, however, is a problem for moral relativism, because this normative implication seems to remove all of its prescriptive power. If one were to tolerate all moral disagreements, one would need to tolerate even its opposite, which is intolerance. As such, tolerance cannot be prescribed, because even the claim that toleration is moral and imperative cannot be regarded with objective, universal acceptance. This is one of the strongest objections of moral objectivism against moral relativism. Because meaningful criticism is impossible in moral relativism, it is considered a significant challenge to ethics in moral reasoning. Now, ethical relativism has two subtypes: subjective ethical relativism, or moral subjectivism, and conventional ethical relativism, or what we also call moral conventionalism. Their main difference is that moral subjectivism claims that moral judgments are relative from person to person, while moral conventionalism claims that they are relative from convention to convention. As a metaethical theory, moral subjectivism is the view that the rightness or wrongness of actions are relative to a person's subjective feelings, preferences, and inclinations. Now, there are serious normative implications that stem from this position. If this were true, it would seem that morality becomes reduced to the level of personal taste. In this view, little or no interpersonal criticism is logically possible, since the absence of all objectivity means judgments are beyond reproach. Notions of good and bad, and right and wrong would cease to have interpersonal evaluative meaning. In other words, moral subjectivism challenges the very notion of morality. On the other hand, moral conventionalism is the philosophical position that states that the rightness or wrongness of actions depends on the society's conventions or culture. Moral judgments are accepted or justified by virtue of their conformity to certain conventions or cultures to which they belong. In this view, morality is considered a society or culture's own making. Morality is made by different people in different situations and different times, asserting that different social contexts produce different standards for morality. There are significant merits to this view, especially when one considers the value of positionality and context in determining what is morally significant. However, if the claims of moral conventionalism were true, it means that one cannot meaningfully criticize anyone outside of their own culture, and so no society or community can claim that their moral beliefs are correct or that their moral conventions are more acceptable. No group could ever intervene with a culture they are not part of. Another serious implication of moral conventionalism is the emergence of conflicting moralities. As the plurality of cultures and conventions among social groups prescribe conflicting moral principles that are all equally valid. This creates a difficulty in deciding which moral principles and standards to follow. Or worse, it creates a loophole through which people can exploit a culture and use it as a pretext to justify behavior they actually believe is unacceptable. However, there seems to be a general acceptance of the view that we must be able to criticize cultures or conventions that oppress minorities and violate basic human rights, and that we must be able to identify cultural or conventional moral beliefs that are more preferable and reasonable. These expectations are predicated on our recognition of some objective or universal moral standard, which calls into question the strength of moral relativism as a metaethical theory. Since moral relativism comes with some alarming challenges, part of our task is to identify both its merits and limitations in relation to other metaethical theories. Moral objectivism, too, is not free of criticism, and the different versions and subtypes of moral objectivism also face their own set of challenges. Nevertheless, considering these perspectives and inquiring about the nature of our moral judgments and principles, alongside their semantic and epistemic implications, is essential as we engage in moral philosophy.